Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the opening keynote of the inaugural 2013 Homeschool Conference. This is the little engine that could. This is a conference that we pulled together in a matter of weeks. We're so excited. This is a chance now for those of you who are participating live to indicate where you're participating from. Look to the left of the map. You're looking for a star icon. You can click on that and then click on the map. And then it's fun if you put something in the chat. Maybe let us know where you're participating from, the time, the temperature. Funny comment from Missy. Especially if you're not in continental North America, it's fun to know. Looks like we have India, China, maybe Italy or Turkey, Sweden, I'm guessing. Peru, I know we have Peru. Lainey Liberty is here from Peru. Lainey's speaking in the conference. If you want to look at some fascinating websites, look Lainey up. Okay, so Pat, while we're leaving the map up, this is on a wing and a prayer here, pulled together in a matter of weeks. Do you want to say anything about that?
Well, you know, I guess I'd just like to say that we did pull it together in the last few weeks, but this is an idea that we've been kicking around for about a year. And Steve really intrigued me with the concept of an online ecumenical global homeschooling conference that was crowdsourced, that had significant input from users. And we were wondering, you know, if people would rally around this concept. And given just the short amount of time that we've had to put it together, and you know, I know some speakers had to bow out because the time pressure was too much for them, but they look forward to doing the next one, as do Steve and I. But I'm still amazed at the quality and the variety of presentations that we have from around the world.
We've had about 1,500 people sign up, which it's hard to gauge, but I think it's good. I mean, it's probably a very small representation of the larger audience, but exciting nonetheless to have that many people.
That's great. And I think we want to do a special call out to our keynote speakers: Clark Aldrich, Jerry Mintz, Cindy Gaddis, Elliot Washore, David Albert, and Dr. Peter Gray. All of them have generously contributed their time to this event, and we're very grateful for that. And all of this is possible because of the internet, and all of it will be available for free listening afterwards, mainly due to Steve Hargadon's efforts. So thank you, Steve, once again.
Yes, and we do need to thank Blackboard Collaborate for the use of the tool, the platform that we're in. They have really been supportive over the last few years, and I did work for them for some amount of time previously when they were Illuminate and then when they were Blackboard. But we've just so appreciated the platform and its stability. So Pat, are you ready to go?
I am ready to go.
Okay.
All right.
So we're going to kick you off here. I've got some notes in the chat on the homepage that some people are having trouble getting in the room, so I'm going to go troubleshoot that, and I'm going to let you start things off.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Steve. Steve has asked me to give the opening keynote, and it wasn't hard to come up with a topic since I've been working hard for the last year to bring out a new book about John Holt. The Legacy of John Holt is what it's called, and it was just released on Tuesday, August 20th. Now, it wasn't intended to come out that way. It wasn't the week of this event. You know, it was supposed to be published in June, but Carlo and I were dissatisfied with the cover design, and then illnesses and summer vacations got in the way, and so now the book is released, and I'm so happy to announce that. One of the reasons that I think that that people respond to John Holt is because of his writing. Even though they didn't know him, they kind of get a sense that they do know John from his writing. And recent studies of unschoolers by Dr. Peter Gray show that the families he studied overwhelmingly cite John Holt's work as their main influence for unschooling. And what unschooling meant for John Holt was simply not doing school at home, not turning your home into a miniature school. And as I thought about this incredible growth of homeschooling over the past 35 years, I mean, right now we're probably over 2 million homeschoolers. I understand the U.S. Department of Education is going to release new numbers of homeschoolers in America sometime in August. Not much time left, guys, so let's see if it comes out. But the last time they did it was in 2007, and the numbers had grown then to 1.5 million children being taught at home. I think it's safe to say that in 2013 there's well over 2 million children being taught at home. And look at the growth. When John Holt was alive, he estimated back in 1981, maybe 20,000 children were being taught at home. That's an incredible amount of growth in about a 35-year period. I mean, most alternative schools would love to have that sort of growth. And then, it's also, but despite this growth, I've been really struck by the lack of serious attention given to John's work. Although homeschoolers and unschoolers give it due attention, and even people who don't consider themselves unschoolers or who don't have or work with children, they tell me that John's writing strikes a deep chord with them and leads them to question their basic assumptions of schooling. But what is it about educators that they just dismiss? They don't even think about these ideas, or if they do, they don't do it in reference to Holt and the whole school of thought that he represents. Why then is Holt not better known today? I was fortunate that while I was pondering this question, Carlo Ricci, a professor of education in Ontario, Canada, was prodding me to bring out all the issues of Growing Without Schooling magazine bound into a printed volume. Growing Without Schooling, or GWS as it's known, is the magazine John Holt founded in 1977 and published until his death in 1985, and which I took over and published for another 16 years. I had decided in the late 1990s to reformat, lay out, and index the first 12 issues of Growing Without Schooling because they'd basically gone out of print, and to sell it as a bound volume. However, that effort was tremendous to do, and the sales were slow, so I decided not to do a second volume. Then, in 2012, Carlo suggested we bring all 143 issues out into print so they can be available to individuals, schools, and libraries. I told him about the problems I encountered doing this in the 1990s, and Carlo said, "Don't worry, I wouldn't have to do any such work on the project," because he had graduate students and friends who were excited to help with it. There were a lot of false starts as we tried to figure the best way out, but it was eventually decided that we had to retype every issue, and that's when my heart sunk, because that was exactly what I had to do with the first 12. How could we do that? Carlo was undeterred. He said, "We'll just put out a call for volunteers." So he did it through his network at the university, and I did it through Facebook and the Holt GWS site. And in less than a year, every issue of Growing Without Schooling has now been retyped by people. And when we asked the volunteers why they did it, many replied, it's because it's John they want to help. Many shared how John and his writing were an important part of their lives, and they wanted to give back. What is it that makes people respond this way to an author, and an author about education, no less? While we worked on the GWS project, Carlos suggested we ask people who knew John to write about his influence on them as a way to celebrate John's life and work. I thought that was a great idea, and I drew up a list of people to contact who knew John and who might be willing to write about their relationship with him. As I looked through my own personal photos and slides, listened to old cassette tapes, and read the various books, papers, and memorabilia of John's that I still have, I donated the bulk of Holt's letters and papers to the Boston Public Library a few years ago, and anyone could go there and read them today. But as I was going through my personal collection, I realized the John that I knew as a young man was actually an even more amazing person to me now that I am in my 50s. I didn't really appreciate John then as fully as I do now. I mean, after all, I was 24 when I first met John and started working with him. And though he was a very approachable and friendly man, I was very respectful and deferential to him. I mean, he was my employer, after all. Of course, within a year, that professional distance between employer and employee diminished, and John and I did become good friends, but I was always in awe of him. You know, John had a policy of allowing parents to bring their children into the Holt office. And, you know, it was one of his ways, one of his nickel and dime ways of social change, as he called it, to actually try and unite living and learning. And the photo that we wound up choosing for the cover of the book is a photo that was taken by Maggie Sadoway in 1984, the year before John died. And every child, I can identify every child in his office but one. And in the book I do. But it's really striking to me how, let's see, well, that's John there. And then we have, oh, I didn't mean to do that. Well, anyway, so that's John there. And then we have Bridget and then Finn. This girl is unidentified, but the Finn's mom, Kit, came in with them often to help out. Mary Gray worked for us. That's her son Chris and Josh, I believe. And that's Solon Sadoway, who is now, they're all grown up. And what's interesting about Solon is he is now married to another homeschooler that I believe he met at the Not Back to School camp. So his homeschooling journey really was meaningful to him. But these are all the kids that were part and parcel of seeing their parents work and seeing us talk about ideas, participating and playing around us while we did the jobs of packing books, interviewing people, writing, getting the magazine done. And John loved that. Sometimes we would even walk around the office with a tape recorder and follow the really young kids, you know, the toddlers, you know, 1- and 2-year-olds, and talk about what they were doing. John really did back up his talk with action. And that is evident in every essay that was written about him in the legacy of John Holt. People who knew John bring his quiet but forceful personality to light and present his ideas about children and learning as part of their lives, not as educational theory. There were several families who were close to John, but one family was especially close to him when I first started working with him in 1981, as the Wallace family. Bob and Nancy, that's Nancy, that's Bob, and then we have Ishmael and Vita, of course, John. John helped Nancy Wallace get her first book published about homeschooling, called Better Than School, and he was one of her biggest fans. John visited their house a lot. He loved to be there with them. And Vita writes about these visits in her essay. One of the stories she tells is this: I don't know whether John introduced jam sessions in our family or whether we'd been improvising together already, but they were a great way for me to play with John and with the family. I only knew a few pieces on the piano and couldn't read music yet, so I sometimes felt left out even when our family sang around the piano. But from the beginning, John encouraged me to play. He encouraged me to play fire engines up and down the violin and play like the pros, fearlessly and with flourishes. We improvised knock-knock sonatas together, beginning with 2 knocks on the wood of the violin or cello and continuing with musical questions and answers. He was an exciting musical playmate, though I remember being bored by his endless careful tuning of his cello. He didn't seem to have the sense that anything was impossible to do or learn, and he encouraged us to learn by just doing. Vita captures John's musical spirit beautifully. He was not a great cellist, but he enjoyed making music tremendously. When I interviewed Dr. Berrien Moore, a camping buddy of John's for many years, he said, once we were talking about Glenn Gould, he was a Canadian pianist, humming and making music, and John began to make cello sounds. John was not a good singer or a musician in a pure sense, but boy, he sure could make a good cello sound. And it came out of the deepest part of his body. He sat there and leaned up against the tree and played an imaginary cello, making wonderful cello sounds. And so he would do these things, these kind of little bit wacky things sometimes, and just enjoy it. And then he picked up his imaginary cello and off he went hiking. So many of the writers in the book note how John played both imaginary and real cellos with relish. Roland Meehan, a British professor who invited John to speak in England, opens the book with an overview of Holt's work and starts his essay this way. When I met John Holt at the Birmingham, UK railway station, he was easy to recognize since he was the only passenger carrying a cello. The somewhat unusual piece of luggage was an indication of the priority he put on his music in the later years of his life. He was speaking at various conferences around England, and in between his speaking engagements, he would return to our house and settle down to play. Before he played the cello, which John didn't take up until he was 50, John played the flute, which he describes in his musical autobiography, Never Too Late. I don't have any photos of John playing the flute, but when I interviewed Alec Close, he noted how attached John was to his flute. Alec and the Talbott family were friends who went camping with John for many years. Alec remembers one trip in particular. That trip is vivid in my memory. We arrived and had to hike about a mile or a mile and a half from the railroad whistle stop into the Pine Lakes and then paddle in our canoes to the cabin. We arrived at the cabin and we had to shake out the mattresses where mice had set up housekeeping. That evening, or one of the early evenings, we watched a magnificent display of the aurora borealis. The sky turned bright green. John, at that time, was not married to his cello. He was married to a flute and stood out at the end of a dock and started playing. I remember John and the loons competing with one another to fill that sky with sound. It was a remarkable thing. It was magical. When John was first diagnosed with cancer in 1984, one of the first things he decided was that he wanted more time to play the cello. So he doubled his speaking fees and cut back on his travel to do so. John and I shared a love for music, so I totally understood his desire to make music with the time he had left. In fact, I remember him making the comment more than once at this point in his life that he felt that making music was more enjoyable for him and people because it didn't cause the harsh disagreements that his ideas about education caused when he spoke about them. In fact, John encouraged me to learn the tenor saxophone, and he did it by paying for my first 10 lessons. It's a gift that I have benefited enormously from, both emotionally and musically. In fact, I continue to play the saxophone, and every time I play a gig or just play on my own, I remember John. John was a teacher of 5th graders in elite private schools in Colorado and Massachusetts, and he was a very conventional teacher at first. However, with his custom of close observation and patient thought, he noticed his high-power students and fellow faculty were engaged in a charade of learning rather than authentic learning. Roland Meehan describes it this way. There were various strategies that emerged from Holt's observations. Some students resist any involvement at all because they do not want the embarrassment of making mistakes and learn to avoid it. Others attempt to find tricks to locate the right answer. They are the producers who focus on feeding their teachers the right answers that are so clearly prized above all else. They jump at right answers, and if they fail, they fall back into despair or defeat. It does double harm if they do get it right answers by their strategies. And here Meehan quotes Holt from How Children Fail. When a child gets right answers by illegitimate means and gets credit for knowing what he doesn't know and knows he doesn't know, it does double harm. First, he doesn't learn. His confusions are not cleared up. Secondly, he comes to believe that a combination of bluffing, guessing, mind reading, snatching at clues, and getting answers from other people is what he is supposed to do at school. That this is what school is all about. That nothing else is possible. Meehan continues, others try to please the teacher, whether they have any clue as to the right answer or not, by waving hands in the air enthusiastically, provided at least several others, including some successful producers, have their hands in the air too. A common strategy, Holt noted, was mumbling answers. For a teacher anxious to get a right answer will assume that anything that sounds close is meant to be the right answer. An associated strategy is guess and look. Holt describes it this way. There was a good deal of the tried and true strategy of guess and look, in which you start to say a word, all the while scrutinizing the teacher's face to see whether you are on the right track or not. With most teachers, no further strategies are needed. One of John's closest friends was Peggy Hughes, whose children he taught when he worked at Shady Hill School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Peggy writes how her 9-year-old son, Bill, became passionate about the cello in 1958, and how John nurtured his learning. Peggy writes, that determined 9-year-old cellist went with us on Fridays to sit in long, waiting lines on the floor of Symphony Hall in Boston to get rush seat tickets for the regular afternoon concert. We ate picnic lunches, read the paper, and knitted, played chess. One autumn day, the new headmaster at Shady Hill decreed Friday afternoons to be for football practice. 9-year-old boys playing contact football? John fortified my opposition to an edict that I would never have dared mount on my own. It was the old fight. Who owns the child, parent or school? Thanks to John's backing, we continued to go to Symphony Hall those Friday afternoons, and my children went to another school next year. This idea of John supporting people and giving them the courage to act on their observations and their beliefs is echoed in so many ways in these essays in the people that I've talked to about John. By working on this book, I learned in more detail John slowly and logically developed his ideas, particularly about his support for homeschooling. Berrien Moore told me about how John worked through his ideas during a camping trip. What's interesting to me, Berrien says, is that there were two aspects of homeschooling that I remember very distinctly that John and I talked about. One was that he foresaw the enormous success that homeschooling could achieve and has achieved. He also saw very clearly and had some deep concerns about the potential rise in religious fundamentalism that could flourish in a purely homeschooling environment where you are not challenged by, say, scientific facts. He knew it could become a doctrinaire element, and he was quite conflicted about that and didn't know just what should be done. Because the last thing John would go for would be to put some regulation on homeschooling. He would really pound you if you said something like that. I remember that we were on one long hike in the rain, and I remember him arguing with himself in a way I don't remember him doing all that often. I remember this distinctly, that he was almost playing chess with himself as to how to work this out. Later, we were hanging out in Pinedale, Wyoming for a day before heading to the airplane, and I was asking him about it, and he was saying that it was still really bothering him, that he had been thinking about this for a long time, and then went into some of the nuances. He painted a very clear picture of the ups and downs, with even more detail than I normally had heard from John. He saw the great potential of homeschooling, but he was also very worried about it, and some of his concerns you see now. There are a lot of fundamentalist areas, particularly in the United States, where there is wonderful homeschooling being done, and yet the concept of evolution doesn't get taught. The Earth was created 5,437 years ago. Some really nutty stuff, and that is, as John saw it, a real downside. Despite John's misgivings, and this is me talking, not Berrien, despite John's misgivings about the downside of homeschooling, John was always a champion for individual rights, and in particular the rights of parents to direct the upbringing of their children. In a showdown between institutions and individuals, John felt the individual should be favored, particularly since his experience proved how wrong-headed institutions can be about people's lives and needs. John also championed children's rights, and his book, Escape from Childhood, shows how adults and children can share rights and responsibilities. But that's an idea that's even more controversial than allowing parents to decide whether to send their children to school. One step at a time, or as John joked with me a few times when I started projects, Don't start vast projects with half-vast ideas. John needed to figure out how to negotiate the political and legal landscape for homeschooling starting in 1977, well before the Homeschool Legal Defense Association came into existence. He took a different tack than most lawyers do. First of all, he never hired a lawyer. Next, he read the actual cases and laws himself, not abstracts of the cases. And if he had questions, he would call a lawyer or professor to check them out. By and large, he learned by doing in this matter. And since in 1977 there were so few lawyers who even knew about constitutional and case law about homeschooling, Holt was charting new territory once again. John advised families to hold their ground, but to stay out of court as much as possible, which also runs contrary to most law professors and lawyers I know. And he provided lots of supports and reasons for doing this. For instance, Larry and Susan Caseman, who are the founders of the Washington Parents Association, and longtime homeschoolers and writers about homeschooling, they have a beautiful essay in the book about John Holt and the politics of homeschooling. And they note how John's work provides examples for children and adults who learning outside of school, and how John was able to use this as evidence that people are natural learners. Then, John showed devastating evidence of how schools undermine learning. The Casemans then write, John helped parents develop much-needed confidence that they could help their children learn despite their own doubts and disparaging comments from school officials, friends, neighbors, and the media. Holt wrote in the first issue of GWS, anyway, your kids don't need, don't want, and couldn't stand 6 hours of your teaching a day, even if you wanted to do that much. To help them find out about the world doesn't take that much adult input. Most of what they need, you have been giving them since they were born. As I have said, they need access. They need a chance sometimes for honest, serious, unhurried talk. Or sometimes for joking, playing, and foolishness. Or sometimes for tenderness, sympathy, and comfort. They need much of the time to share your life, or at least to not feel shut out of it. In short, to go some of the places you go. See and do some of the things that interest you. Get to know some of your friends. Find out what you did when you were little and before they were born. They need to have their questions answered, or at least heard and attended to. If you don't know, say, I don't know. Perhaps above all, they need a lot of privacy, solitude, calm, times when there's nothing to do. The Casemans continue. In writing directly about the politics of homeschooling, John made it clear that parents have a basic right to homeschool their children. This was especially important because in the late 1970s, if a family mentioned homeschooling, a common response was, is that legal? John acknowledged that the state has a right to ensure that children do not grow up and become a burden to the state. But he also pointed out that existing laws and court cases support a parent's right to homeschool. In short, and I've cut out a lot here from what the Casemans wrote. In short, John's suggestions to parents for dealing with political, legal, and legislative matters paralleled his approach to ways we can help children learn. Recognize that you have the right to do it and shoulder the responsibility yourself. Recognize ways in which you are better equipped to do this than others and have confidence that you can do it. The two messages together are more powerful than either one on its own. I was particularly struck by that last paragraph by the Casemans. There's much truth in it. I hope you'll read this essay by the Casemans, but I do want to highlight 4 of their final 8 points that they make about John and homeschooling, because I think they have bearing today. Oh, that's John. I fell a little behind on my slides here. That was John on a camping trip with Barry and Moore at one point. area. These are his 4 points. Use common sense. Be alert for potential allies and opponents. Ask yourself what motivates them and where you agree and disagree with them. Communicate in clear, straightforward language to improve the chances that others will understand what you're saying, even if they don't agree with you. But also stand firm. Don't be intimidated by public officials and so-called experts and the overblown, misleading, and just plain wrong claims they often make. I have to, as a brief aside, I wrote about this on my blog a few months ago, how up in Vermont, the schools decided that parents needed to supply more paperwork and get certain approvals before they could homeschool. The Vermont homeschoolers immediately checked the regulations and laws and said, no, they're not called for. And they were able to make the school committee back down and revise all this stuff. You know, the schools will interpret these laws, and you can too. But, and this is point 3, don't attack the public schools or say things that are likely to alarm the general public and supporters of public schools. When possible, reassure opponents by reminding them, for example, that not that many people will ever want to homeschool. And then finally, work with other homeschoolers. Communicate with them. Facilitating communication among homeschoolers was one of John's goals with Growing Without Schooling. Share resources, ideas, and things that work for you. Now, related to this essay is one by Theo Giese in the book about how John helped her and the homeschoolers of Virginia change the homeschooling law there. I could quote at length from Theo's essay as well, but I hope you'll read the book instead. I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to have to skip over many interesting stories and facts that I learned about John from doing this book. But I need to do so to also talk about John's biggest influence on the public, and that is through his writing. We chose people to write for the book who knew John personally and were influenced by him. But there was also a large category of people who loved John and his work, but who never met him personally. That's why we asked Kirsten Olson, the author of Wounded by School, to write the introduction to this book. I first learned about Kirsten when she contacted me about her dissertation that she was writing about John Holt and the other school reformers of the 60s. But she was really taken by John's work, and she really understands it. And she told, when I asked her how she found out about John's work, she said she was trying to find out what to write her dissertation, that she was really kind of dissatisfied with what, the topics were and how her, the whole class at Harvard and was at that time just devoted to the Common Core and trying to make schools work. And she just kind of felt that John and Illich and those people had the right approach. That maybe this is just, school is a nutty idea and we should try another way. There are other ways to help kids learn. And she discovered John's books on a pile of books in the wider library that were being thrown out. They were in a discard bin. And she picked them up and read them. And it led her on her path to write her dissertation and create her ongoing support for John's work and his ideas. It was John's words that got to her. And then several people in the book who eventually met John in person, but they talk about how it was his writing that influenced them first. For instance, both Wendy Priesnitz and Theo Giese note how their lives seemed to parallel John's writing about schools, with each new book of John's shedding light on their experiences as teachers and parents before they even met John. Dr. Thomas Armstrong writes about his meetings with John, and specifically the writing advice that he provided to Thomas. Merloyd Lawrence, John's last editor and a close friend of his, writes, John once wrote about one of his heroes, the Swiss scientist Louis Agassiz, who began a college course by placing a single fish on a plate and asking his students to describe it. Every time they brought him their papers thinking that they had said all there was to say, he asked, what else? He did not stop until they had seen and recorded 100 times more than at first try. John might well have been describing himself when he went on to write, it is this ability to see and then to describe accurately what was seen that is the hallmark of the great naturalist. Merloyd ends her portrait of John with this: everything that John put into words in books, letters, or talks was first-hand. Whether he was describing didactic adults or children at play, or even a head cold, his intent was to make sense of his experience. His avoidance of theory brought an unusual modesty. He brushed off the success of his best-selling titles as mostly an accident. In the 1970s, the great demand from colleges and organizations for him to lecture did not go to his head. John said, "I thought I was changing people, but discovered that when I was introduced as a controversial speaker, that was code for, this guy is full of shit, pay no attention." The roots of both this modesty and John's acute observations ran deep. Every branch of science rests on assumptions, he once wrote. The mission of questioning those assumptions, whether in views about slow children, in notions that adults could not learn music well, challenged in his lovely memoir, Never Too Late, or in his calm, logical, and always kindly correspondence with others of fixed opinions, educators, scientists, creationists, or politicians, lives on for all of us in his writing and in his example. When I made the announcement this week that The Legacy of John Holt was published, I was pleased by the report and gratified by the report it received online. Cindy Gaddis, a homeschooling mom who writes about special needs children and who was one of our keynote speakers, posted this: "It was reading John Holt that helped me understand the power of observation of children. This observation and response to it is the center of how we homeschool." I love that. And that's exactly why John felt that parents can teach their own children, even if they didn't have high school educations themselves or any education courses. If you observe children and think about what you're watching, the children will show you or teach you, so to speak, how you can help them learn. But you have to trust in your own abilities to observe and draw conclusions and learn from mistaken assumptions. As Wendy Priesnitz writes in her essay, "I was encouraged that John, like me, figured this out firsthand through observation of children rather than by reading other people's work or taking courses at the academy. Years later, when I was asked by an academic which writers had influenced my thinking about self-directed learning, I said, to his horror, that I'd figured it out for myself, because to have done otherwise would be incongruous. So I chuckled when I read John's comment in A Life Worth Living, The Selected Letters of John Holt. There seems to me a suggestion that in learning about the world, other people's books are more important than observation. With this view, I most emphatically and strongly disagree." Trust yourself to be a good observer and helper of children. You'll get better with practice. Trust yourself to read and understand laws and regulations that govern you and challenge their interpretation. If homeschoolers didn't challenge the compulsory school laws and act upon their rights, the interpretations the schools preferred for those laws, everyone must go to school, would be much more strongly in place today. John wrote passionately about how we can trust children and ourselves, and he provided a model for such behavior in his life and writing. And of course, as several of his friends note in the book, this came back to bite John when he developed cancer. John's skepticism of modern medicine is well-founded, as you'll read in the book, and it led him to delay conventional treatment of his melanoma until it became too late. Jenny Wright, whose essay ends the book, shares some letters from John to her about death in medicine that are quite moving. For me, personally, another of the great gifts John gave me was not just his friendship, but the friendship of others through him. Many hadn't heard from me for decades, but as soon as I suggested they write for this book, they jumped at the chance. However, two people have become special friends to me because of our relationship to John and our work together on his magazine, Growing Without Schooling. And they have helped me in Holt's works in innumerable ways. They are Aaron Falbell and Susanna Shepard. Susanna writes movingly about how she met John and joined him in his work, and what this means to her today as she works with homeschoolers part-time at North Star Learning Center and in her main work with family members of murder victims and family members of people who have been executed. Susanna talks about John's influence on her, beginning when she was in 5th grade and wrote John a letter about the book of his she read, How Children Fail, and she agreed with John's portrayal of school and sought his further thoughts. Susanna writes, "For me, John's work was so much about paying attention to people's subjective experience. What is school like for kids? Sitting in the classroom, observing and making the notes for what would become the book How Children Fail, John kept asking that question and paying attention to the actual answer. The answer that was close to the ground of experience rather than to a lofty belief about what school might be like or ought to be like. And because he paid that kind of attention, he was able to write what he saw in a way that let others, including the 5th grader I was when I first read How Children Fail, connect with it. Today, whether I'm listening to a teenager or to a capital defense attorney, the question that gets me, today, whether I'm listening to a teenager or to a capital defense attorney, the question that gets me quickest to the heart of what I'm interested in is, what is it like? What is it like to be you, to do what you do, to go through what you have gone through? I also felt John's influence keenly when I first got involved with this newer work, and this was instantly way outside my zone of familiarity, comfort, and at first, competence. I had to tolerate a great deal of not knowing and not understanding, and I had to try not to resort to all the defensive and self-protective strategies that John had described so well. I also had to trust in my own sense of what was compelling and what I most wanted to learn at that point in my life, and to let that be the reason to pursue whatever new project I was pursuing. Susanna edited a book of John's letters called A Life Worth Living. And in her essay in the Legacy book, she quotes a letter of John's that I know that she likes. She wrote about it in GWS too, and she liked this quote. It's really good. One might say, John writes, one might say that one of our important life tasks was to find our true teachers, to make our own university. Certainly, to find one of one's own teachers, someone from whom we think we can learn something really important, is one of the really great pleasures of life. When people tell me John Holt is a romantic airhead who will let children do anything they wanted, I'm puzzled. Have they read a book of his, or just cherry-picked a passage to criticize? After all, it isn't hard to see that in every book John wrote, he discusses teaching. But patient, gentle teaching that always supports active learning. Not today's instruct and test, move and sort the kids along the conveyor belt of school teaching. By the way, John was comfortable being called a teacher, but he hated being called an educator. It had too much connotation of the expert doing something to people for their own good, of the teacher becoming a technician, sort of like janitors becoming sanitation engineers. Whereas in Holt's conception of teaching, when a student asks someone to teach them, they are able to share information and skills with them at the level the student is ready for. It's that simple. John always knew and said that learning is state-dependent, and that even for the wealthy students he taught, if they were in a bad emotional state, learning doesn't happen, despite what the tests and the teachers claim. As Aaron Falbell says in a note in his essay, Norm Lee, a friend of John's, once quipped that John Holt could just as well have titled his first book, How Children Feel. Aaron's essay discusses how he discovered John's work during his work on his doctoral dissertation in education. After becoming friends with John, Aaron started to think differently about working in education. and he became an organic farmer and political activist instead. He also married Susanna Shepard, another unforeseen benefit from meeting John Holt. Aaron makes an important point about an important aspect of John's work, something that gets twisted and confused in so many discussions about unschooling and John's work, about how all we have to do is just leave children alone and they'll learn everything they need. Aaron writes, I think many thought John was implying that since children were good at learning, therefore they would learn everything they needed to learn, to know, as long as they had access to it. All one had to do was to get rid of the nasty element of coercion, and then children would effortlessly and joyfully learn all the things we want them to know. But I don't think John was saying this. He knew that there were no guarantees when it came to learning. He knew that when we try to ensure or guarantee certain outcomes, that's when we get in trouble. In the revised edition of How Children Learn, John wrote, all I am saying in this book can be summed up in 2 words: trust children. If being good at learning meant that learning would be automatic or guaranteed, then we wouldn't need to trust children. We only need to have trust and faith in something or someone when we don't know the outcome, when the outcome is not guaranteed, when it might not happen. Similarly, if John Holt were alive today, I think he would be saddened by the efforts of some people who try to turn his term unschooling into some sort of system, into a set of rules that must be followed. John trusted parents to learn from their experience with their children. He didn't say, if you're going to call it unschooling, you're going to have to do it my way. He wanted them to figure out what was right for them, for their whole family. His advice and ideas were available as guidance for those who wanted it, but he didn't want to turn unschooling into, of all things, a type of curriculum for parents. This, I feel, was to his credit. It revealed the deep humility of the man. Yeah, there are so many stories about John and ideas. I would love to spend a weekend just talking about John's work overall and his personality. And I am so grateful that so many people shared their stories in this book. One thing, though, that I have to point out, and everyone mentions it, not everyone, a lot of people mention it, is just how funny John was. I just want to share a couple of lighthearted photos of John that I found. This was one of him messing around with the cello, as he liked to do, with a family that he spent a lot of time with, the Marrs. Tom and Mary Marr and their children had John at the house many times in the 80s. And obviously, he entertained them a lot. And then, when he was in Mexico studying with Ivan Illich, or working with Ivan, I guess talking with Ivan is probably the most accurate way to put it. This photo was taken. I just found that in the slides. Well, actually, Susanna Shepard found it in the slides. This is from the Life Worth Living book. The legacy of John Holt, a man who genuinely understood, trusted, and respected children. By the way, it was Aaron Falbell who gave me the subtitle to the book. This book is a labor of love that I hope will inspire you to pursue your own truth and bestow your own gifts to the world, rather than to be processed by school to pursue what they think is important for you, and to bestow only school-approved products to the world. Our world is increasingly becoming more standardized and monitored, and the promise of the Internet to free us to be responsible, self-determining people is quickly turning into the dystopia Orwell and Huxley portrayed, where schooling, economics, technology, and politics conspire to tightly control society, rather than open it up so all can learn and grow in their own ways. The legacy of John Holt is, above all, to embrace life and to share our experiences through friendship and mutual assistance. As John said in a letter in 1983, a life worth living and work worth doing. That is what I want for children and for all people, not just or not even something called a better education. So those are my thoughts about the legacy of John Holt. I've been seeing a whole bunch of comments fly by, and Steve has offered to moderate them. So I have time for questions now.
So I'm going to be limited here because I've been distracted by all kinds of other things, although it was really hard to pull myself away from your talk. That was really, really fun, Pat. But I didn't pay attention to the chat. So if you put a question in the chat, I apologize. I'll encourage you to put it in again. Lisa asked, do you know if John attended a homeschool conference at a campground in Ohio, 1976, 1977?
Oh, boy.
That's a very detailed question. You can also raise your hand to ask a question. If you have a virtual hand, it's the third icon over in the window. Go ahead, Pat.
I don't know if John was there, and I am amazed at the amount of footage that exists out there of John Holt. I mean, I have some, but it turns out that, so 2020, that's a new one for me. I didn't know about that. I'd love to see it. But if you go to Hulu, there's a talk show called The David Frost Show, and there's an hour interview with John Holt there. And David Frost is a British interviewer. It was quite good. So I haven't paid for the Hulu fees, so I haven't seen that one, but I know that's there. And I've linked to some of them on the johnholtgws.com site. There's a great one talk that someone turned me on to. It's a radio show of John Holt being interviewed by Studs Terkel. And I know John spoke very fondly of Studs. They were personal friends as well as professional friends. So what are some other questions that we have?
So if you have another question, Steve wants to know, can you speak more specifically about where you see dogmatic unschooling that crosses a line that you say John would draw?
I would say, it's very difficult. I mean, and this is the thing. It's very difficult to know what's going on in parents' lives and children's lives. But one thing John always felt was that you should respect children. And one of the things that I think happens with homeschooling and unschooling, although probably this is a thing that a lot of unschoolers would, but, I mean, I've been criticized for it, it's letting our children go to school. And as John writes in Teach Your Own, that's a difficult question. And, but if they have good reasons, you should let them go. Well, he doesn't even say that. He indicates that it's up to you. Because I do know this. While he publicly spoke about, if a child really has good reasons, not like they want to ride the school bus or drink chocolate milk in the cafeteria, but like they want to learn something that you can't, or they want to be with kids and participate in certain programs that you couldn't do at home or with your homeschooling group, those were valid reasons. And, I've seen more often than not that if your kids go to school, many unschoolers say, that's it, you're done, you're out of the unschooling club. And that really, I think that's one of those lines. Because, my own experience, my youngest daughter moved in and out of school 3 times. I write about it in Teach Your Own, and I talked about it at the Harvard lecture. So if you want to get more details on that. But I think that that's one of those really big lines where unschooling gets much more dogmatic than John ever intended. But I do want to say this. I know personally that when John knew the family, I heard him give advice not to let the kids go to school. Only once, but I knew this family well. And he said, I wouldn't do that because your son, his name I'm not going to say, he didn't feel that he would really do well in school. So again, it's balancing children's rights and adult rights. And I think that all too often, when unschooling becomes dogmatic, it's the rights of the children trump everything. Let them do everything. And and it's ironic because the drawback to a lot of homeschooling is that the parents become dogmatic in the other way. You can only do school subjects, and you can't do anything until you finish doing your schoolwork. So I think that's one of those dogmatic lines.
Maria has a question that you put in the chat, but she also raised her hand. So, Maria, if you'd like to take the microphone, you can.
Hi, I'm Maria. So my question is, what grown-up communities understand these messages well? Where can our kids go when they become teens and seek grown-ups who are like-minded and understand non-coercive learning and non-coercive work, most importantly?
Well, when I got started in this in the 1981, there was no internet, and there were very few groups, and we just publicized it and found each other and created groups. Now, there's a lot out there. And particularly for teenagers, you know, the Not Back to School camp that Grace Llewellyn operates on both the West Coast and the East Coast. In fact, I think one of the sessions is taking place right now as we talk, is a very, very powerful experience for teenagers, and they speak very highly of their time there. But also, you know, this idea of non-coercive education is getting out there more, and there are more like learning centers specifically for teenagers. I'm thinking of the Princeton Learning Co-op. They're going to talk. They are presenters at this conference. So Maria, you should listen to, try and attend their workshop, and maybe you can be inspired to create such a place for your child in whatever country or state you live in. And then there is also independent co-ops that are being created by homeschoolers, and they tend to only last for like maybe a couple of years or even a couple of months, depending on the needs of the families that form them. But there is a group in Portland, Oregon called the Villages, and they, again, you know, I believe they have a Montessori inspiration, which is wonderful, and you know, they're certainly akin to some of John's ideas, and they actually support one another by creating a village, but not like a city, like you know, it's just more of a virtual village of the family, but they share resources and so on. And another thing that we wrote about in the 1980s was co-housing and creating co-housing communities. But the cost of doing that is pretty expensive. However, I was lucky enough to be invited to speak last year to the Mass Home Learning Association at a co-housing community in Massachusetts that was largely founded to support homeschooling. So there are many, you know, options out there, and I can't urge you enough, you know, to pick up the homeschooler unschooler ethos, which is, if it's not there, build it and do it yourself. Don't think that just because it's not there, it can't be done.
Hey, Pat, we're 2 minutes away from the top of the hour, at which point we have other sessions starting. So I think we'll stop there. Do you want to leave contact information in case people want to contact you directly?
Yeah, it's funny. I didn't. Let me see. I didn't prepare my slide that has. Or did I? Let me see. No. Anyway, I guess the best way is to contact me. Yeah, it's not there. At johnholtgws.com. Come there and you'll find email links. I'm happy to talk with you, and I'll be updating that site again. It's been a busy couple of weeks, as Steve has indicated. But I am happy to respond to email, and you know, and also to get out in public and talk. So if you're local, look at the site, and perhaps you'll find some speaking engagements that will be coming up too. So thanks a lot for listening, and I look forward to chatting with folks online over the next few days. I'm going to bomb in and out of the conference as often as I can. And I can't thank Steve enough for making this happen. It's really, really a neat experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pat. Great job. Thanks, everybody. So we're going to close this room out. I encourage you, if you're able to go to the next set of sessions. We do have to ask you to exit the room for the recording to process, so you'll notice that if you haven't left the room in the next minute or so, I kick you out. Take care. Bye now. Thanks, Pat.
Bye. You're welcome, Steve. Thank you.